Hi, welcome to Tuesday, April 17th. In today's readings, we're going to get some wonderful insights into how God is preparing David ultimately to move on to kingship. And as I read this today, I was thinking, it's one thing to be anointed by God for a purpose, but it's another to be able to be prepared for it and to handle it. And we kind of see this play out firsthand, and we see the continuing accounts of Saul and David and their back and forth, but we certainly see the difference and the contrast between Saul as king and at least who the next anointed King David is like as they interact together. Let's take a look at some of these things and just see if we can point out what are some of the characteristics or some of the learnings that God is putting David through to sharpen him for what is to come down the road. You know, there is no substitute for experience, and the difference between David and Saul is very stark. If you remember, and I was trying to think back to when we read about Saul being anointed as king, Samuel anoints him as king, he goes back into his fields. Ultimately, Samuel says, okay, I'm going to pick out the king and I'll show you who God has chosen. And they literally had to find Saul hiding amongst the baggage and drag him out in order uh, to show him to the people and say, this is who God has chosen for kingship. So anyway, that happens. Saul's kind of wondering what he should do next, and all of a sudden the Ammonites surround Jabesh Gilead and cause them trouble, and messengers are sent out, and Saul basically gets angry, puts some guys together, and goes in and battles. And from that point on, he never looks back. And that was it. That was the extent of the training. The rest of it was kind of on the job. And in the end, maybe what we find out is Saul was really ill prepared for the position he was to undertake. And his inexperience and lack of forging through struggle and strife, along with his own personality, ultimately does him in, even though God had put him in a position. And in fact, God turns away from Saul at that point where Saul erects an altar and decides, I don't need the priests, I can do this myself, as he's getting ready for battle and becomes impatient. We find out then that Saul spends the rest of his time chasing David and brooding through the rest of his reign. Now David, by contrast, we know makes some mistakes later on in his reign. However, he does extend and unify the kingdom, and even in his mistakes, what we find out from David as we read the Psalms and other accounts is that he always has a heart that's after the Lord, even when he blunders and he does so badly. So we look through these things today, and there are a few lessons David has learned, and David displays some characteristics which will serve him well as king. Number one is he certainly chooses his friends well. And once again, Jonathan comes to his side and encourages him at a difficult time when he's hiding out with Jonathan's father after him. And Jonathan not only reminds him that he's anointed king, he will be king, his dad, Saul, is not going to take his life, and that David should take heart. And they renew their covenant, their relationship with one another again. So number one, he surrounds himself there with good people. Number two, David shows himself to have some marvelous restraint and not attack and kill a man who basically has it in for him. And this, of course, is true where David and his soldiers are hiding out in the cave, and Saul goes in to relieve himself, and David, as you know, cuts off a piece of his robe and then lets him know that he could have killed him. And the other interesting part about that is not so much that David showed restraint, but then when he tells Saul, you can see how much he still loves this man and wants to honor his king and his master, even though this man is trying to kill him. The phrases in chapter 24, if you read them, were, my lord the king, he addresses Saul. He also says, I will not lift up my hand against my master because he is the Lord's anointed. And the third thing he says is, see my father. All ways that David addresses Saul and shows his love for him in the midst of that. Well, then we move on and we realize as we go through this that while David has now come to a point where he's got some 600 men serving him and following him around, and he's got to take care of them. He's dependent upon the people to be generous. It's not like him to take his army in and just plunder wherever they go. So he's also wise, and he's got some political savvy, because he goes to this place where Nabal is the leader, and it's festival time, it's shearing festival, and so people are going to be in a good mood, and he thinks that'd be a good time to send my men in to see if those people will provide for us in any way. What we learn, number one, is while Nabal is very wealthy, that's about the only good thing we can say for him. He's also very mean. We also learned that Abigail, his wife, is far wiser and far more loving than he is. So while Nabal threatens David, Abigail goes out and makes peace to save her people. And David then shows that he is smart enough to honor her request, to make peace. And in fact, he later marries her, um, which I think is wife number 3 by this point, but that's another story. Of course, we find at the end of this, Nabal is not so lucky as God deals with him. But all of these things show how God is preparing David for kingship, and all those difficult daily decisions that a king must make. Now, we will soon see how these skills and this good judgment play out in David's life. And what we learn, I'm sure, is that they're great to have, they're important, but they will mean nothing if God is not still seen as the one and only king. Now, that kind of brings me to the end here, and what I would share with you today, because this is what stuck out for me, is God, I think, anoints all of us into his purpose. We're all called. That's not just for kings and pastors. We all receive God's anointing for a special purpose in our lives. We are called and we are sent. And what I was wondering is, as events take place in our lives, as we grow in wisdom and stature, are we thinking of those things in terms of what God is preparing us for, that we are being readied for something? And do we even think about that, or do we go through our lives thinking we're already here and we are what we are? And I want to continue to pray about that and examine that for me in my own life, and to kind of get a feel for what is God calling me to? Even though I may be where He had me at one point in my life, what does He have for me in the future? What might He be preparing me for down the road? And so I'll be praying about that today, and I would encourage you to kind of think along those same lines. What skills is God equipping you? How are you being shaped and formed for His purposes? And as you ponder that, we'll look forward to talking with you again. Have a great day.